And I'm pleased to welcome Bernice Mireku-North, a member of the House of Delegates in the great state of Maryland, representing District 14, Montgomery County.
Yes.
My uncle's old haunts in Silver Springs,
Yes.
So we'll have you pull his file later, see what secrets we have on it. Thanks for taking time to chat with us. What do you hope to get from this event?
Well, this is my first time at NCSL, first year, my first term. So I'm really focused on making sure that I get as much information as possible from not just the speakers on subject matters, but really from the legislators themselves and their paths to success in terms of getting bills passed, working with constituents. So I really treated this opportunity as a huge learning experience as I've had throughout this whole year, really.
And you know, we live in a nation now that we're told is divided and everything's a blue state or a red state, but you come to an event like this and where it's based on themes and issues, do you find that there's sort of a common language? I mean, education, K through 12, if you go to a session on K through 12, there may be a bit different approaches, but there's understanding of many of the same issues. Do you find that there's an ability to transcend partisanship on discussing these issues as you go about gathering ideas?
That's a good question. I really think that this conference has really done a good job and make sure you hear both sides of the issues. We've talked about social media and kid online safety, and as tough as those conversations were, it was fair to have both sides of the issues come to the table on it. So as legislators, we can come and understand when we go back to our districts what other people are thinking besides the folks in our own district that voted us in. It's very important to hear all sides of the argument, so when we do advocate for certain legislation, we know what to expect and how to go forth with what we want to champion.
And I've quipped a few times that you can listen to all the ideas, and some of them you may want to copy, and some of them you say, thanks for doing that, because it was such a horrible idea. Now you suffered the bruises in your state, and we can learn from your mistakes. Lots of topics here, 100 plus topics on, you mentioned all sorts of things. Can't be everywhere at once. What are your priorities in terms of this event, and certainly your priorities back in Annapolis?
Right. Well, as I mentioned, kid online safety is really big in Maryland. We have one legislation that I co-sponsored with a colleague of mine who's here that did not make it out of the Senate, but it did in the House where we represent. So hoping to support him again next year. But I serve on the Ways and Means Committee, specifically Early Childhood Education Subcommittee, and so I'm focusing on making sure that we have bills that address the 0 to 3 or even elementary school level bills in terms of making sure they have the resources that they need to thrive in schools, making sure their health is considered, particularly with having access to recess more or just mental health resources, and that also means looking into teacher retention and retention of those professionals in the school systems. In Maryland, we are pushing for we call a program called the Blueprint, basically transforming how we're doing education in Maryland. And this particular conference allows me to kind of see some of the things that we have yet to implement while we're going through that transition. So that's probably one of the hallmark pillars of my work for Annapolis going to session next January when we come up in January 2024. I also have a criminal justice background, so I'm still committed to working on criminal justice reform issues, particularly in the area of women in prisons, kind of emerging what I've been working on with early childhood and criminal justice. I want to establish something like a prison nursery for our Women Correctional Institute in Maryland, similar to what is currently done in Indiana, but we're modeling a Minnesota program right now, and so I'm currently working with stakeholders to get that passed, and also tackling mental health, and not just with kids in schools, but just with families, making sure that, for one, they have the ability to kind of move where they need to move for the health of their families, and so looking at rental agreements and how we can expand the ability to terminate leases based upon mental health, because right now it's just focusing on physical disabilities. So I definitely have a wide range of issues, but it always comes down to making sure our kids are safe in our schools, making sure we're tackling mental health, and making sure that communities have the resources they need to thrive. And so with that, I also want to say that I'm working on trying to make there is more equity in our tax system as well. And so I'm looking into potential ideas in that sector as well. Being on Ways and Means, that's kind of like the name of the game.
The purse
yeah, exactly.
Helps to fund your priorities when you're also on the budgeting or the committee that dispenses the funds.
Exactly.
And several of the issues that are priorities for you. we'll all stipulate they're important, but they certainly were brought into clear focus during the pandemic, where we talked about education, those early stages where development is so important, and mental health. We'll probably be dealing with the repercussions of mental health for years. One of the themes of this summit, at least I think it's come up in a few sessions, is the notion that the federal government was able to step in the delivery of health and human services and education with additional funding for the states during a time of crisis. Now the challenge is, of course, as that funding eases off, or in some cases ends more abruptly, STEM states are better positioned than others to continue on in their growth pattern and not sustain a heavy blow. Where are you all in your state, and how can you ensure that some of these important areas are still funded in the absence of that level of federal funding we saw during the pandemic?
Excellent question. In Maryland, we are currently facing a deficit, probably for another 2 years. But what we stand committed to is making sure that our work in education does not fall on the wayside because of this deficit. So we are being very mindful with our dollars, making sure that what we are putting our money in, it's for the future, and it's really focusing on our kids. That gives us the benchmark to say, okay, this is the thing we're willing to put money into. We're going to have difficult conversations this couple of years, very difficult conversations, and everything that we want to have a price tag for, we have to say, well, how's it going to affect us long term? Is it worth putting money in now? So we're definitely having some tough conversations this couple of years, but I know that, things don't happen in a couple of years in the State House. It takes time for everything. So as long as we have diligent advocates and legislators in the State House and Senate, we'll be sure to get a lot of our long-term goals done, despite the federal funding might be coming at the end of certain areas.
It is always challenging. Every member of any state's Ways and Means Committee always knows the difference between one-time funding and ongoing. One is a little easier than the other. Sometimes, it'll be that significant spike, but there's always another budget cycle, another year, and I guess that does present an unusual challenge, and it's wise for you to say, look at that.
And not just the education, but with working families too. We passed a low-income tax credit recently that we know the federal funding is going to be, running out, if not has already run out. But in Maryland, we made that a priority, and so those are things that we say, well, look, even though we're facing this deficit, we have to make sure our working families, our children, have the resources they need so they can thrive despite our fiscal deficit at this time.
Let me ask you one more question. I want to hear your perspective. I want to hear everybody's. I've asked this to everybody who's sat there, and since you're a relative newcomer still, filled with enthusiasm, I want to hear your hadn't been beaten out of you yet. As I've said, we've all taken civics classes, but in my case, it's been a while, and other maybe folks. And folks may think they know what goes on in Annapolis or Indianapolis or another state capital, but they oftentimes get you confused with Washington or City Hall. Like, what do you want your constituents or folks in Maryland, or anybody for that matter, to know about what you and your colleagues, both sides of the aisle, what are you about? What do they need what are they missing, or should they remember about what you all do?
Right. Well, the State House, I always say to, my constituents is that it's different from the county or even the city level. Like, we can't necessarily, fix your pipe, but we can find someone who can provide the funding to get that project going. I feel like we're kind of like just turn on the light switch in a lot of ways for counties and municipalities to do what they have to do locally, for school boards to handle what they have to handle locally. Serving on the Ways and Means Committee also not includes taxes, but education. So a lot of education battles are happening at the school board level. We don't have a direct say in, but we can at least say, well, here's the benchmark to consider. Here are things that we can at least evaluate at a minimum. And the different counties and municipalities can take that and run with it and add more, or change it up. But as long as this is a benchmark for us to consider, that's how I see the state government running, as well as, of course, the funding for that. I mean, I'm not on appropriations, but what I say with some of my colleagues, that Ways and Means, my committee, we deal with how to create ways to make money, but appropriation cuts the checks. So making sure that they understand that we really are providing the resources for counties and municipalities to do their thing, and also kind of be a way of handling issues that the federal government doesn't address. Like gun control is a big issue, and recently in Maryland we passed a gun control law that basically says you can't have wear and carry openly in a certain area of the state. Subject to litigation right now, but these are things that states can do that federal government hasn't really found the right solution for. So I really say the state's kind of a go-between towards like what the federal government can't quite do yet, and like I said, kind of turn a light switch and open the door for municipalities and counties to kind of run with some of the things that we're providing foundation for.
Wonderful. Well, I wish you well. Thank you for your commitment to public service and for taking time to chat about this particular event and your views beyond. Bernice Mireku-North, District 14.
Yes.
Montgomery County, Maryland, House of Delegates. Thank you for taking time to chat with it. I
Thank
appreciate
you.
it.
I appreciate your time. Thank you.